artists and critics and scientists and on and on and on. So my approach in looking at him, I mean, first of all, Kepish is interesting. No one's heard of him. So he's interesting, one, because he's been overlooked. And then two, because he worked with science and technology at a moment in the 1950s, 1960s, when that was a new, very new thing to do. And that, of course, is a really relevant thing now. I mean, we think so much. We all use right now. We're all using computers to meet. We use electronic technology all the time. It's like second nature. So to look at an artist that did this before it was the norm could be very illuminating and could reveal things about how we use technology today, how artists use technology, and how they respond to it, et cetera, et cetera. So he had sort of interest, I think, relevance to the present. My approach, though, was really conventional in the sense that I looked at his old letters, I looked at the photographs he collected, I looked at all of his papers. You know, I spent 3 months one summer cataloging everything, so nothing in the archive had been organized in any way. So I helped to create a finding aid that said, oh, all the letters are in this folder, in this box, and here's one from another letter from 1980, and here's one from 1985, and on and on and on. And I became very familiar with all the content. So when I went to write my dissertation and then to work on my book, my research method was really about like digging into all of this artist's old stuff and finding interesting things that I could use that would make sense about what we know about his practice and projects. So I'm interested in this exhibition, so I could study the objects that he actually exhibited. I could look at his research notes that he made as he was working on that exhibition. And I might, for example, look at this list and say, oh, this is so interesting. He's looking at all these books. I know that. I see that here in his bibliographies. Some of them are very strange, like this one in the center. Rorschach, Herman Rorschach, Psychodiagnostics, a diagnostic test based on perception. So this is the sort of inkblot Rorschach test. It's created by Herman Rorschach. This is the book that explains how the Rorschach test works. Very weird to me that an artist was looking at that. So my method was like, I will repeat what he did, and I will look at that book and try to understand what is the artist doing looking at these weird, unexpected sources. And I might use that in how I interpret the connection between some of what he's studying and then the work that he produces that we know, the sort of artistic output. So my own method, in a sense, is conventional because I'm looking at the historical record, and I'm reconstructing it and putting pieces together and then researching, underneath based on whatever I learn about the artist's process. So I'm sort of trying to recreate it, the part of the process that you don't see publicly, and understand it better. Okay, so this project had conventional research method. It also had elements of politics, and this is the sort of through line that I want to make, because the real issue for Kepish at MIT as an artist was that he's working with scientists using technology during the same time that the Cold War is happening, the Vietnam War is happening, the growth of what becomes known as the military industrial complex happens. So there's a question that looms over all of his work about what he is doing working with these scientists who, in their own scientific research, are making hydrogen bombs or studying missiles or creating computer systems that can be used to monitor the Viet Cong, for example, in Vietnam, in the jungle, and to come up with methods for where American planes should drop bombs. Does that compromise the artist's artistic practice in some way? The sort of surprising connection through his own collaborators to warfare and to the military. And so this is an issue in all of Kepish's career, but it becomes a big issue in the 60s when there's this backlash to the Vietnam War among students in particular, and then also sort of across American society among activists and others. I mean, not just students. But to give you a sense of this, I mean, this is a pamphlet from UC Berkeley, War Incorporated, the Congressional Military Industrial University Complex. So seeing all of these connections. And then, of course, there's a pamphlet from MIT and the warfare state. So students began thinking about what does it mean to be at a university mostly funded by the Defense Department, with all of the professors working on designing weapons. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what does it mean for Kepesh as an artist to be collaborating with those people? So this was a concern, an interest to me in studying this artist. But I felt at the end of the project, after the dissertation was done, after it eventually finally came out as a book, it seemed still to me like very remote. I mean, I had selected a topic that I could make a claim was very relevant. Technology is so relevant. These ethical considerations around politics seemed very relevant and timely. But my subject was out of date, sort of. I mean, it's a historical project, so it was about an artist who was working in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, and it wasn't about the present. And I started to feel like my work as an art historian was not like up to date in the way that I wanted it to be. And this was really, to be very blunt about it, it was 2016. It's after Trump is elected president. And I think I had, like many, sort of reevaluating about the stakes of my own work. And, did I want to set out on a project that would take 10 years and tell a history about an artist no one's heard of? I think that's important to do, so I don't mean to belittle that. I also did it myself, but it felt a little bit disconnected to the urgencies of the moment, that I think there was a sort of recognition of those issues after Trump is elected president, and in the years since then, when there have been so many hypercharged political debates and issues, whether it's about partisan politics or what to do with monuments or the Black Lives Matter movement reaching sort of peak public awareness, et cetera, I felt like I wanted to be responding more to those urgent concerns. So that's hopefully this gives you a sense of, I'm just gonna jump ahead, a sense of the motivations for this project. Like, it's rooted a little bit in my earlier research, which was very conventional, but it's become very motivated by a desire to respond to things happening now, as opposed to spending a year looking at old letters in a library somewhere. That's valuable, but it's hard to make that feel as timely and relevant. So in this new project, I mean, there's still some of these threads that go back to my earlier book, but I'm thinking more about these very contemporary controversies. So I wanted to focus on one case study from the book, one of these chapters, which looks at the activities of a group called Decolonize This Place. And the moment that this controversy sort of was ignited or came to be, it was really facilitated by this photograph, which I'm not exactly sure, because of course I didn't write down the date of when this was created. I believe it's fall of 2018 is what I want to say. Is that right? Fall of 2018. Yeah. So I think in November of 2018. So a photojournalist took this image of migrants crossing the border near Tijuana from Mexico into the United States. And I mean, this photograph, was a sort of viral image that was circulated across news media. It was sort of everywhere online. And it focused a debate over things like the Trump administration's child separation policy, how the Trump administration was responding to immigration, the border wall. I mean, all of these issues became the focus of a lot of public discussion that fall. And one of the things that people focused on for this image was the fact that there's a tear gas canister right here at the left, and you can see it's, spewing out tear gas smoke. And there were also photographs that photojournalists posted of this woman, Maria Meza Castro, who is in this photograph, holding up these canisters, these tear gas canisters that were fired at her. And it turns out that this canister is made by a company called Defense Technology, which is a subsidiary of a larger company called Safariland. And Safariland makes weapons which they claim are non-lethal solutions. That's their sort of branding. And these weapons are used against civilians by police departments and in things like riot control, to subdue protesters, demonstrators, etc. So Defense Technology makes this canister. Safariland is the umbrella company. And it turns out that the head of Safariland, the CEO, Warren Kanders, is also a board member at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. And so this is a photograph of Warren Kanders and his wife with the director of the Whitney, Adam Weinberg. So this connection, this becomes a controversy because photojournalists fixate on the tear gas, who made the tear gas, why is it being fired at unarmed civilians? Is that a human rights violation? Should we be interrogating the company? And then arts journalists further made this connection and said, well, not only is this just a tear gas canister, it's actually produced by someone who is making decisions at the Whitney Museum, steering the Whitney Museum, giving money to the Whitney. Is that a problem? And so it becomes this very politicized issue by, let's say, December 2018 in the art world around Kanders' participation at the Whitney Museum. So this group of activists called Decolonize This Place, they begin protesting Warren Kanders and his role at the Whitney, and they stage these sort of spectacles, protests on the steps of the Whitney Museum building in Manhattan. They have banners, they have signs, they're sort of gathering and chanting and protesting, and here's signs: we will not be silent, tear gas is deadly, greed is deadly, migration is a human right. You've already seen that image. Dirty money, so pointing out the fact that Whitney receives money that's tainted, quote unquote, in some way. And one thing that is very interesting to me is that this debate happens, it happens at the Whitney on the steps, but what is the purpose of that protest? One of the key purposes is to create images that then can circulate on social media. So this gets to the point that I was sort of suggesting is one of the through lines in my case studies for this project, the fact that these protests, these controversies are taking place online as much as they're taking place in the actual physical space of the museum. And so I've become interested in the idea that these artists and activists are not only adopting very sort of familiar tactics around protesting, and even generating images is a key element of a lot of protesting, has always been the case. The suffragette movement was, suffragettes were white. In part, they could, there could be photographs or images of the suffragette wearing white, and that would make a statement. The civil rights movement did this with, great awareness of the power of images, media images, to frame a debate and to generate empathy and sympathy and anger and other emotions that could propel social movements. So using images is not new. What is new is the fact that those images are online, they're being circulated through social media, and I want to make the claim that that format is actually changing how they operate in different ways. So, this gives you a sense of some of those images online. And one of the key points, which I will return to in a moment, is that uh, I'll show you a little bit some of the claims I want to make around how the online image is framing this issue for people in different ways, and how artists and activists are using social media as a tool to help fuel, motivate or drive people in their protests and in their activism. So one of my sort of general hypotheses in all these cases is that they're both digital but also analog, and those things happen simultaneously. The other is that the controversies are both political but also aesthetic. So this is sort of related. Like, they're about a political issue. The issue here is money. Does money get compromised? And does money compromise institutions and what they do? That's a political issue. But the way that it gets debated and discussed is really about this aesthetic articulation, which these activists and artists contribute to by staging these protests that result in images. So there are different things happening. It's not just a political controversy, there's an aesthetic dimension. And then my third general claim is that they are very contemporary and they're about issues of the present, but there's also a sort of past behind them that can be uncovered. So past and present, analog, digital, political, and aesthetic. Those are my sort of oppositions, and I want to see these events being all of these things. This departs a little bit from the way that these controversies are typically discussed in the media. I mean, things like the debate over Confederate monuments. All of you, I'm certain, are familiar with that debate. There's a political debate that happens, and it takes place in letters to the editor and discussions with people, and then debates in different towns and municipalities. What do we do, et cetera, et cetera. What people have not focused on as much, I would say, and this is what I want to argue, on the other dimensions of that. Like, it's not just political, it's also about, the reason we talk about this political debate or discussion is because of some of these aesthetic interventions. It's how Black Lives Matter protesters have projected images onto the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia, and how they've graffitied over these monuments and, layered on different signs and slogans and images and gathered in front of them and, changed their meanings through visual strategies. That needs more articulation because I don't think that's been adequately explained. So for me, in weighing in these debates, it's in a way, it's like, it's not just about the controversy or the discussion, whether it's Confederate monuments or tainted money, whatever. It's not just debating, oh, here are these two positions, which is right. It's about understanding how this issue comes to be by thinking more about the strategies that the artists and activists are using, the aesthetic strategies and the digital strategies, and then also thinking more about, like, there's a longer history that definitely is not part of the way that these are frequently discussed. So things like, monuments is a perfect example. You can have a debate about a monument now, but you really need to understand, when was that monument created? Who created it? Why did they select a certain type of iconography? Why was that historical figure valorized in a certain way? Like, there's a lot of history behind that that gets overlooked in the sort of popular discussion of some of these issues. So those are some of my sort of general arguments, or the sort of categories that I'm exploring in this project. The other thing that I see my own work doing, and this is maybe thinking about my own research method, is that these discussions now are very familiar to me as an art historian because of an earlier generation of similar debates that took place in the 1980s and 1990s, the sort of famous culture wars debates, which this idea of the culture wars was promoted by this book. James Davison Hunter was the first to sort of popularize this phrase. This book came out in the 90s, and he was referring to debates over religion, public financing of the arts, artists that created imagery, especially queer artists that created imagery that was sexually suggestive or explicit, quote unquote, and resulted in controversies, often from a sort of religious perspective, that denounce that type of art, and the fact that those artists received government funding. So things like Robert Mapplethorpe might be familiar to some of you, sort of iconic example of these earlier culture wars on the left. And then on the right, a photograph by Andres Serrano titled Piss Christ, which shows a crucifix submerged supposedly in a vat of urine. This is another one of these images that created all of this controversy because right-wing commentators, politicians, used this art as an example of why the government should not support public financing of the arts, because the result is that these quote unquote, immoral artists, these, whether they were queer or supposedly blasphemous artists, would create images that were disturbing in some way and inappropriate. And so this, in the 80s and 90s, this led eventually, these controversies led to the scaling back of federal support and funding for the arts. And it resulted in, slashed budgets for the National Endowment for the Arts, different protocols about, the government can't give money to certain types of art. It has to meet approval. It has to be vetted first, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, like looking at some of these events more recently, I see echoes of this earlier moment. And so one thing I want to do as a historian, and then I think this is when I depart from, say, an art critic, I don't want to just think about, what do we do about tainted money in the museum? Like, that's a super interesting and important issue to debate. Others are capable of doing that. What I can do is say, actually, we've had similar debates earlier about money supporting the arts. It just was in a different moment, and it was framed and presented in a different way. It was not about left-wing activists attacking a major museum. It was around right-wing conservatives attacking museums and the government for funding art. So it approached from a different side. Like, there's similarities and also differences, but this is sort of, I think the approach of any historian would be to say, looking back at these earlier moments can actually inform and illuminate what's happening now in a way that we would not otherwise recognize or understand. So, framing it as a culture war controversy allows us to see some of these earlier connections. So that's another thing that I am trying to do as a historian of art, as opposed to just a critic looking at a really contemporary issue. And then the other thing, so like this project departs from like this, my earlier book project. I don't have 100 linear feet of letters and scraps of paper and weird photographs to study at my leisure whenever I want at the library. Like, that's not how it works. So the question is, like, where is the archive? I mean, I'm a historian, so I want to look closely at visual material, textual material, and understand things better using analysis of those materials. So, I don't want to just approach the ethical question, tainted money, what do we do? I want to understand in more complicated ways. So I have to create or invent an archive. And so this project is also, for me, it's like exploring what that might mean. Like, how do you write art history of 2019? Which is not that long ago. So, how can you use historical methods, looking at the archive, recreating correspondence, understanding, digging deep into material to make sense of what's happened? How can you apply that to something really current and recent? And that's one of the sort of interesting challenges. So one thing that I am interested in doing is, as I've mentioned, social media seems to be an important part of this. So that provides one of the archives that I have used. And I'm really, I think I am actually approaching it like a historian. Like, I'm looking at the social media posts from, this is what, December 15th, 2018. So, you have to scroll on and on when you're in your Instagram feed to get back in time, but you can actually recreate some interesting things by, using social media as the archive, the primary source archive that I can use to construct arguments and understand this controversy. So, for example, one of the things, and this was, I think, widely documented at the time, when this protest happened, was that these artists and activists had written over advertisements, so things like subway billboards, that promoted an exhibition that was on view at the Whitney when this photo, that photo I showed you of tear gas being fired, when that was published and circulated in fall of 2018, there was an exhibition that had opened of the work of Andy Warhol. So activists wrote, these very simple, straightforward messages: Warren Kanders must go. And I mean, that had been widely documented. You could see many examples of this. They put their "Decolonize This Place" sticker over the subway advertisements. It's a sort of straightforward vandalizing strategy. You vandalize something to change the meaning. So anyone looking at these signs doesn't see, promotion of the Whitney Museum. They see a reminder about the issues that Decolonize This Place are focusing on. So that's very conventional. I don't think there's anything that exciting about that. But one thing that they also did, which was super interesting, is they used some of the imagery created by Warhol, and these activists appropriated that imagery and then changed it in different ways. So a graphic designer, for example, took this painting, Andy Warhol's painting of Coca-Cola bottles from 1962 or so, and changed it to that tear gas canister that I showed you that's connected to Safariland. And then instead of saying Coca-Cola, they rebranded it as Whitney. So some of the graphic design had interesting visual strategies. And to me, my focus is not just the debate, the political debate, it's also the aesthetic strategies. I mean, this has been less discussed or analyzed, the types of artistic interventions that were being made, and things like appropriating Warhol's paintings because they are on view at the Whitney at this moment, and changing their meaning is a really interesting tactic. And they did this many times. They took this Warhol painting on the right of Jackie Kennedy after JFK's assassination, and then they reproduced it but changed it to the tear gas image. They took this image of this very famous Warhol painting of Ethel Skull, an art collector. Ethel Skull 36 times. I think it's 36. I have to count them. And this painting is sort of famous within art history as this moment in which Warhol discovers he doesn't need to just create paintings about commodity objects. Instead, he could make paintings of celebrities because celebrities are commodity objects in their own right. So it's interesting art historically. It's this sort of iconic moment in which he shifts towards portraiture and making portraits, and especially wealthy patrons and celebrities pay him to make these sort of quickly manufactured silkscreen images. The activists then, they mimic this, and it's very, I think, really sort of dark and ironic. They take this image, another sort of glamour shot of a sort of Warren Kanders and the director of the Whitney at that art opening, the image I showed you, and they recycle it in the same manner as if it is a sort of reproduction of one of these famous Warhol paintings. So, it's an interesting appropriation not only of the type of imagery Warhol made, but if you know more about Warhol, you know that he is attracted to the sort of glitz and glamour of celebrity culture. It says something to know that. You can understand how these activists are framing that and appropriating that and making a commentary about the glitz and the glamour that also adheres to the art philanthropists, regardless of where their money comes from. So part of the unpacking how this activist image works requires knowing something about the source material. So that's another place where I see my own role as an art historian as potentially helpful in intervening and shedding light on some of these interesting visual strategies. Oh, there's the original photo, which I've already showed. So, I mean, it goes on and on. There's so many of these examples, and they're all really great in different ways. So this is another image. It shows Superman. It's referencing this painting by Warhol. It's like one of the first Warhol paintings to address or to use comic strips, which then many other pop artists also do. So it's very early for Warhol. And he has Superman and this quote he's just lifted off of a comic strip. These activists have replaced it with a phrase here that says, "Always make sure to run against the wind when tear gassed. Keep calm. The pain will pass. Don't touch your face or put water on it. Instead, use milk or Coke." So they're actually taking, I mean, I Googled this phrase. This is my new sort of research method. I Googled this phrase. It appears in a tweet. I believe the tweet was first posted after the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, around the shooting of an African-American man, and these protests around police brutality in which tear gas was fired at demonstrators. And so someone tweets out, if you get tear gassed, water won't wash it away. You have to use milk or you can use Coca-Cola. And so Decolonize This Place takes this Warhol painting and then they swap in this tweet. And, it's interesting not only that they're referencing this particular painting, it's also interesting that they're referencing this tweet, which takes us to the debates around, the sort of early Black Lives Matter debates around Ferguson and Michael Brown. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I just noticed the chat and got distracted, which always happens. And I mean, it connects the actions of, this is what I'm trying to say, connects the actions of Decolonize This Place, not only to Warren Cantor's migrants at the border, but also now to Ferguson. So it helps us understand their protests by creating another reference point, like a high, supercharged reference point that is also part of what their activism is about. So, mining these sort of images that might seem very casual helps us create these connections. The other thing sorry, and now I'm just trying to sort of, okay, here we go. Fast forward a bit. So there are many iterations of this. So the group Decolonize This Place used, sorry, I'll stop scrolling images now. They also took the graphic design of the Whitney's website and mirrored it. So something like, this was the web page for the Warhol exhibition that was up at the time, and they used the same graphic design sensibility to create these posters, these flyers that they put up around New York City, and they swap in Safariland for Warhol. They also mimic examples again of Warhol's paintings, and I'll explain this one with other, it's a sort of fake silk screened image that they've created. They use Photoshop to make it look as if it's a Warhol silkscreen, but again, they take examples of images of tear gas being fired at different activists. So in this one, the reference is to the protests at Standing Rock against the Keystone Pipeline, which was going to go through indigenous communities. And there were protests, I can't remember when this was. I want to say like 2017, probably 2016. I don't remember. But there are protests against this pipeline. And it was another instance of when tear gas, and this includes Safariland brand tear gas, is fired at demonstrators. So again, this provides another sort of reference point, another sort of node in the discussion. It's not just Safariland tear gas at the border with Mexico. It's not just Ferguson, Missouri. It's also now Standing Rock and those debates. And also, the activists there were indigenous in part, and it raises questions around indigenous activism and land rights and a whole nother set of issues. So, tearing back these images is illuminating to understanding what's happening. And since I know, like, Cole wanted me to emphasize research methods, like, how do I understand this? I mean, what I did is I I think I was Googling. I was using the internet as my archive. So I Googled Safariland tear gas and I scrolled through pages and pages of image searches and I found photos that looked like these photos that were used. And I mean, I found the same photos that Decolonize This Place used in producing this type of flyer. And you click on the image, it goes to some story from 2016 or whenever it was that explains the fact that Safariland tear gas was used, et cetera, et cetera. So, like my own research method, it's actually sort of traditional in a sense. Like if I'm looking at a painting, just to take a sort of arbitrary example, as an art historian, if I'm looking at an old painting, a Renaissance painting, let's say, or Dutch still life, I might see an object in that painting and not know what it is, and then do research on, where does that image come from? There might be a Dutch still life, so there might be a serving dish that has a particular pattern on it. So the art historian would then want to know what is that dish? Who owns it? Is that expensive? Was that mass produced? Was it made by hand? Was it made by a machine? Like those might tell you something about that still life, why it was created, whether it is an expression of wealth, like all these other issues. And so you're trying to find the source of that image. In fact, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just taking, a sort of quickly made Photoshopped activist pamphlet, but I'm applying that same art historical method towards deciphering that image that will then take me back to these sources, which I think is useful and illuminates the type of imagery that activists have used. Okay, so I have other examples of their graphic design, and this is the sort of key thing I wanted to get to. Not only, as I've mentioned, are they creating images that intervene in art history in sort of tongue-in-cheek way or against Andy Warhol, because Warhol was on view, they're also using the Whitney's own branding, and then they're using digital platforms in unique ways. So, for example, they take the Whitney logo, which is this sort of what the Whitney describes as a flexible logo. It doesn't have to look one way all the time, so it doesn't always look this way. The W can shift around. So, like if you look at their website, it might be stretched out in different ways. They'll fit it in on posters to stretch it out. It isn't like one simple visual emblem. It's quote unquote flexible. So the activists repurpose it and create images. And here, for example, they have a tear gas canister. They've turned that W into a stream of tear gas, and they say, "You uphold white supremacy." And then they brand it Whitney up at the top. And so they're creating these sort of visual hacks into the graphic design, not only by using Warhol as a reference, but also the branding of the museum itself. And they also then use the same branding against Safariland, the company that makes the tear gas. These strategies are, I think, really interesting to look at. They're not like super new or innovative on their own. They're drawing from ideas like culture jamming, brand hacking, other approaches which predate, 2020. I mean, they go back to the 90s and 80s, et cetera, of manipulating pop imagery or logos. I mean, pop artists are doing the same thing. So there's a much longer trajectory. But one thing that I found that was really interesting, and this is when I think the digital archive has potential, and the idea that like studying the digital archive, presenting, framing that, and then exploring it can reveal interesting things. The way that they tagged their post that says "You uphold supremacy," white supremacy, they tagged it Safariland. So if you look at that hashtag, you would get images promoted by Safariland of their own promotion. So, images from their own Instagram account of, people with guns and gun, whatever they are, holsters and different assembled weapons and all the rest. And, people brandishing these weapons with what I think we could say is, pride and enthusiasm. And then you also have the Decolonize This Place logo that is like slipped in there using the hashtag as a means to append it to these other images. And so, like, what is the effect? This is interesting to me because this is not just, hacking the Whitney brand is, I think, very effective. And there's a sort of sinister appeal of how they've done that. It's pretty interesting. But it's like even more interesting that they discovered if you hashtag it a certain way, you can then have the "You Uphold White Supremacy" claim pointed at Safariland in this way. And like specifically, the people who are posing with and promoting Safariland weapons. And that seems like a form of digital activism, which is different than the conventional brand hacking, culture jamming strategies. So, if you keep exploring this, they also use the Whitney Museum hashtag. You would then end up on Instagram feeds with things like selfies, the museum selfie. So people posing in front of works of art at the Whitney. I mean, here you can see a lot of Andy Warhol because that was on view. And then you also have this claim, "You uphold white supremacy," which is now like redirected not only to the Whitney, but also to the patrons of the museum, the viewers at the museum who have posed for these selfies. So to me, this is a sort of ingenious method, tactic of, very subversive way of making this message and directing it, to different people in really targeted ways. No one has talked about this because this is not like the debate around Candors and the Whitney is around money and the ethics of money supporting the arts. So this is when I think like my own contribution, if I mine through all of these Instagram posts and think about what does the hashtag do and what things are put in juxtaposition, you end up with these sort of startling and uncomfortable juxtapositions. And I think that is actually a tactic that they're using, and it deserves to be discussed more as an artistic strategy, an aesthetic strategy that the group is using. So I think that's all to say, like, this is why I'm going down this rabbit hole of clicking every hashtag and exploring everything, because you can come up with different ways to understand things that are happening. And I can shift away from a familiar debate around tainted money to this other debate around the strategies and tactics that artists and activists are using. I mean, it continues on and on. They did quite a lot of this. So here you have explicitly a reference to Ferguson. Again, it then brings up images of Safariland weapons. The juxtaposition is really, whatever this is with the American flag on it, and then this up at the right, like it's quite startling to me. So I think it's a really interesting way to trace one thing that these activists are doing. And so they're layering all of these strategies on top of one another. So this is another, I guess I'm here in the Safariland hashtag feed or whatever, and another image from some of these activists appears, and it has, you'll see there's a group of people in front of a painting, and they're wearing t-shirts that say "Less Lethal Solutions." So that is the Safariland tagline that the company uses to promote their products. Tear gas doesn't kill people. It's actually not true. It can kill people, but they brand it as if it doesn't really kill people. It just controls riots, quote unquote. And so they use this tagline, "Less Lethal Solutions." So the activists visited the museum. They stood in front of a painting by Andy Warhol, which says 129 die. And then they reframe that painting, which is referencing a plane crash in the 1960s, and they relabel it using their t-shirts that says, now it says "Less Lethal Solutions." It's referencing Safariland. They create this image. They then hashtag the image a certain way, and then it appears in this feed juxtaposed really directly against, I think, these very frightening images of people brandishing weapons. And so to me, this is a really interesting mixing of the art historical reference, the social media manipulation, text and image recaptioning that's happening. It's sort of layered on top of all these different strategies. And this is the original Warhol painting. And that's the original newspaper that Warhol painted. It's also referencing earlier strategies that artists used in the 1960s, especially in protests against the Vietnam War, where they stood in front of paintings and held up images and texts to reframe the meaning of those paintings. So this shows a group called the Art Workers Coalition. They're standing in front of Pablo Picasso's famous painting Guernica, which is about the bombing of the Spanish town in Basque Country during the Spanish Civil War, right before the Second World War. The town is bombed by the fascists, by Nazis, by the Germans, in support of fascists in Spain. And so, this painting was about 1937. These activists stood in front of it with images of violence from American bombing in Vietnam and said, this is actually also a painting not just about 1937, it's also about 1969 and what's happening in Vietnam. I mean, that strategy is really similar to what Decolonize This Place is doing. It's, they're saying this Warhol painting, we think it's about the 60s, it's about the present. And if we stand in front of it and relabel it, then we can make this historical image contemporary. So this gets to my big theme that these debates are often historical and contemporary at the same time. Like their strategies are about taking visual images that are familiar and reactivating them in different ways in the present. They do that in different ways. It's not just standing in front with T-shirts. This activist stood in front of Warhol soup cans wearing a gas mask. So the gas mask is a reference, obviously, to tear gas. It also then re-signifies the cans of soup as tear gas canisters. So there's a sort of an interesting reuse of the historical imagery. And this is interesting to me as an art historian because paintings exist in the past, but also exist in the present. I mean, that's just factually true of every painting that was made really at any point in time. When you go and view it, you're seeing it in the present. So your own perception and interpretation are based on the present. And yet that painting was made in the past. And so those two times coexist. And it's interesting how these activists are very sort of canny about recognizing that and taking images of the past and then re-signifying them, making them mean something different in the present by standing in front of them or using props. To see the soup can as a tear gas canister, I really don't think actually that has probably happened at all until this. No one would have looked at the Campbell soup can and thought, oh, definitely Warhol was thinking about tear gas. I mean, he wasn't. So that's never been an interpretation. And now it makes so much sense. It's very strategic in what these activists have done to change or shift that historical meaning. Okay, I have another example of that, which I think is very compelling. Oh, I'm just gonna look at the chat. Okay, it's not relevant to me. Okay, so some other images. So, this repeats a lot in the visual culture of this particular episode. So I mentioned already this flyer with this image, which takes us to the protests at Standing Rock against the Keystone Pipeline, which would have been constructed in native land, which raised the risk of pollution, environmental pollution in that area, which is then protested, and then tear gas is fired at the demonstrators. And so the way that this image was used, it's in red, white, and blue. And it's a really specific reference, an art historical reference to this painting by Warhol, in which Warhol has taken images from the civil rights era. So photojournalistic images that first appeared in Life magazine of images of violence in Birmingham, Alabama, in which the Birmingham Fire Department used fire hoses and the police department used canine attack dogs to suppress peaceful demonstrators. And so these images, these are some of the most sort of iconic images of the civil rights era. And Warhol copied them using a silkscreen process in his own canvases. And so you can see here, this image is specifically this one. I'm trying to make sure. Yes, it's this one in the lower left of this spread from Life magazine. And Warhol takes it and repeats it. And I mean, this is when something that happens in the present raises an art historical question that could be interesting to think about. So there's a long-standing debate in studying Andy Warhol around what it means that he used some of these highly charged images. Do we see Andy Warhol's use of images of civil rights demonstrators being attacked? Do we read those images and say, oh, this shows that Andy Warhol is very sympathetic to the civil rights movement? He's really fundamentally progressive. He is anti-racist. That is one potential interpretation. Another interpretation is, oh, Andy Warhol has an uncanny sense of what is happening in a culture and how to generate fame and celebrity by identifying those images that are so powerful. So this has nothing to do about his personal politics. He is using a supercharged image uh, in his own work simply to promote himself by using the spectacle of these violent images. So he is profiting from this type of imagery by appropriating it in a way that is not politically progressive at all, has nothing to do with civil rights or the civil rights movement. Instead, it's in his own self-interest. So like that's a very opposite interpretation of what Warhol was doing. That debate has existed in art history for a long time. I mean, it marked the reception of his paintings when they first appeared. There's been, some really great art historical research looking specifically at Warhol's paintings around issues of race and civil rights, and debating whether or not they indicate his own what sort of empathetic position around civil rights, or whether he's just profiting from appropriating those images. I mean, it's an irresolved, maybe irresolvable debate that's existed art historically. So what's interesting is that this contemporary use of this image helps us get back into this existing sort of old established art historical debate and see it in new and different ways. And I think that these activists, Decolonize This Place, they're very smart, they're very educated, they've studied art history, so they know what they're doing when they make these connections. And in fact, I think they're inviting us to revisit the Warhol paintings and see them in different ways. So, I mean, one thing that is super interesting is like this debate over Warhol's use of media imagery opens up this other debate around media imagery in the present. So, if we can see Decolonize This Place using the same strategies to appropriate pop imagery. Again, this is another image from Ferguson that they've used, and recycling that imagery in their paintings. Like that's also a form of a sort of intervention in media. So Warhol is like looking at Life magazines and stealing media. Decolonize This Place is doing the same. They're like Googling online to find images of Safariland tear gas and taking those images. Is their process different or the same? Does their process tell us about what Warhol was doing? Is their process, is it framed by the same questions of whether it's a sort of self-motivated, use images of violence to create spectacle? Is that what they're doing? Because that's what Warhol maybe was doing. Or do they reflect progressive politics? Like we can connect these different debates together. And that's one thing that I want to do. The other thing, as I mentioned, they're very canny in their art historical references. And I think this is a really great example. They take, sorry, I'm jumping too much. They take